There's nothing that I enjoy more than a good campfire. The smell of smoke, the way that stars dazzle like diamonds in the coal-black sky, the songs and laughter punctuated by those long periods of silence where we're just sitting and listening to the fire crackle. But because I live pretty much in the middle of an urban city, I have to be willing to travel to get a really good campfire. Sometimes I have to be able to go to faraway places and sometimes even to faraway times, which is what I did last week when I circled around the edges of a dim orange campfire outside of Jerusalem about 700 years before Jesus was born, give or take a century. It wasn't a really big fire. Even from a distance, I could tell that it was one that was built more for warmth and safety than for a party. But as I grew nearer, the actual grimness of the scene became more apparent. The sheep and the goats, they looked thin. And the dust that they kicked up made my teeth feel gritty. The men, they had their heads together and were speaking in a very hushed, somber tone. And the women, they were scraping out the bottoms of their dinner pots. They looked especially haggard and chapped. I thought, maybe this isn't a fire that I wanted to hang out at, until I spotted a group of giggling and wiry children. They were squirming all over an elderly woman who I was guessing was their grandmother by the way that they were climbing all over her. She was patting the ground next to her and encouraging them to come settle down so that she could tell them a story. And that looked encouraging. I love campfire stories. So I moved in that direction, unaware that the promise of a story itself could become a contentious matter. "Tell us about Lot's wife," pleaded one child. "No, we heard that story last week," said another. "I want to hear about the great flood." "A story with lots of water sounds good in times like these," said the grandma. "No," whined the other children, "we're tired of hearing about Noah." "You're right," said the grandma, scanning the somberness of that camp, her eyes narrow with worry. "There's another story that I want to tell you tonight. It's an important one. Maybe it's the most important one that I know, because it was told to me by my grandmother and by her grandmother before that. So I want you to listen up and I want you to remember it. Remember it no matter what happens in the days or the weeks or the months ahead." The seriousness in her voice brought the children and me to rapt attention. What was the story that was so important that she wanted these thin and dusty children to remember? And she began. God put Abraham to the test. Now, I immediately knew where she was headed, and I was befuddled. This story had scared the bejeebers out of me as a child. What kind of God would ask a parent to do something like that? And I remember that I asked my own mom whether she would kill me if God told her to do so. And she just laughed. And she said I didn't need to worry because God doesn't talk much to people anymore, as if that was supposed to be consoling. And I could tell that for these children, they might be having some of those nightmares soon also. As the grandma set the scene with that long walk up Mount Moriah, the gathering of stones, the placing of wood, the children, they seemed to inhale but not to exhale. And when we got to the part where Abraham prepared for a fire, like the one that was right out there, right before our eyes, but with his son now right in the middle of it, well, one child, his hands jumped up over his ears. And Abraham raised that knife. Another's hands jumped over her eyes so that she could only see through slightly splayed fingers. And there was a long pause. And then the grandma's voice, it rang out loud and clear. "Abraham, Abraham, stop!" and we were all frozen in place. And not just us, but the others near that fire as well. The women, they looked up from their scrubbing, and the men, they too glared. No one moved while she finished the story about the ram that was in the thicket going into the fire instead, and the stars, the millions and billions of stars, and the sand, the millions and billions of grains of sand, and Abraham having even more descendants than that, because God was so pleased with Abraham's faith. God was pleased that Abraham was willing to make an offering of his son, asked the girl with the splayed fingers. Ah, said the grandma. Throughout all of history, from Abraham's time till now, some have thought that if they offered God the best that they had, their very own children, maybe God would end the drought or the famine or the flood that was making their lives so hard. Abraham wasn't the first person to feel gravely tested, and others have had that kind of faith. But then she leaned in as if she wanted to tell us a great secret. What makes Abraham's faith different is that Abraham, he was listening. He was listening so careful for God's voice that he could hear God say, "Stop." And he obeyed God's command. He found out that the God who he followed was not a God who wanted death, but a God of life. And all the way till this day, no matter how bad things get, no matter what our neighbors do, we who are the descendants of Abraham, we who are the offspring of Isaac, we know that God never wants us to sacrifice our children because our God abhors such a thing. Now, there was a long silence. I doubted whether things were so bad that they had ever considered doing such a thing as sacrificing a child in a desperate move to regain God's favor. But then I remembered that this was 7 centuries before Jesus, and such things were not totally unknown at that time. The situation of this camp, it did seem pretty dire. Had such a gruesome thought crossed anyone there's mind? And we all sat and listened to that fire crackle. And as I stared into the flame, I was feeling glad to know that I didn't live in this century, but in 21st century America, where child sacrifice is no longer even a consideration, thank God. But as soon as I'd had that thought, another little voice began to surface in my mind. Is that really true? I think of just this past year. I think of the way that we as a nation have opted out of the Paris Climate Accord, uncommitted to protecting the environment for future generations. Is it true that we're utterly unwilling to sacrifice our children? And I think of the tax changes that our bishops spoke out against, reforms that will raise the debt of coming generations while cutting benefits for poor families. Is it really true that we're utterly unwilling to sacrifice our children? And I think of our inability to pass meaningful gun regulation in the 5 years since Sandy Hook. Is it true that we're utterly unwilling to sacrifice our children? And while none of these things are made in the name of God, we don't seem to think that God is very upset about it, that God has anything to say about it, truth be told. Do we believe in the God of Abraham, the God of life who abhors death? Or do we still worship some other God different than the one that our biblical ancestors told us about? Do we worship a God who still with great urgency yells, "Stop"? Perhaps the most that we can say is that this is a campfire story that we have not forgotten. Haunting though it might be 2,700 years later, we still know when we ponder this tale, even if we have a hard time putting its core message into practice. And I wondered if I should try to tell the old woman that. Would it give her hope to know that we were still holding on to her story, telling it anew in preparation for the lighting of our own Easter fire in 2018? But by the time that I came out of my reverie, the silence around that campfire had already been broken, as one of the men had brought out a flute and another had begun a rousing song. The women had begun to collect the littlest ones to bustle them off to sleep, and the older children were rolling around in the dirt again, laughing. And the grandma, she was leaning back with a smile on her face and looking up at the millions and billions of stars, each of which seemed to be winking back at her like cousins gone long before. I think she was going to be okay. I think they were going to be okay. The God of life was with them and rooting for them, just like God is for us.